Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. Jake Hansen never thought he'd wake up one morning to find a stolen beach on his land. His quiet life as a farmer was about to collide with the arrogance of the Lakeview HOA, led by the relentless Karen Watson. What started as a shocking discovery would soon become a battle for justice, one he refused to lose. Jake Hansen had lived on his 200-acre farm for over 15 years, building it up from the ground with hard work, sweat, and unwavering dedication. It wasn't just a piece of land to him, it was his home, his livelihood, and his family's legacy. Nestled on the outskirts of a growing county, the farm was a self-sustaining paradise, complete with rolling pastures, dense woodlands, and a pristine stretch of shoreline along Silver Pine Lake. His wife, Emily, and their two children, 12-year-old Ethan and 8-year-old Lily, loved the life they had built there. Their loyal dog, Rex, roamed the property freely, keeping a watchful eye on the livestock and playing with the kids. Life on the farm was tough but fulfilling, a stark contrast to the rigid suburban lifestyle that encroached ever closer. Jake's land shared a border with Lakeview Village, a high-end residential development governed by an overbearing homeowners association. The HOA had approached him multiple times, offering to buy portions of his land, or at the very least, convince him to join their association. Jake, along with the other farmers in the area, had always refused. They valued their independence far too much to let a group of suburbanites dictate how they maintained their property. Despite the occasional pressure from the HOA, Jake never imagined they would cross any serious boundaries. He had his own aspirations, dreams that extended beyond the farm work. A few years back, he had envisioned a new business opportunity, building cozy rental cabins deep in his forested land near the lake. It was a perfect location surrounded by towering pines, scenic hiking trails, and a tranquil waterfront. Visitors could enjoy the quiet solitude of nature while still being a short drive from the town's amenities. The plan had been on hold due to the demands of running the farm, but now, with his kids getting older and more independent, he decided it was finally time to begin. One crisp autumn morning, Jake took his truck and drove along the dirt road that wound through his property toward the lake. As he neared the tree line, something unusual caught his eye. The further he drove, the more his stomach twisted in a knot of disbelief. Where there had once been untouched land and a peaceful shoreline, there was now an entirely different scene, a fully developed beach area bustling with activity. Jake brought his truck to a halt, stepping out onto the soft earth, his boots sinking slightly as he took in the shocking sight before him. The shoreline had been completely transformed. A stretch of golden sand covered what used to be a natural lakeside, with neatly arranged lounge chairs dotting the area. Volleyball nets had been set up, and several small concession stands offered ice cream, hot dogs, and refreshments. A carefully paved walkway led from a newly constructed parking lot straight toward Lakeview Village, an HOA-controlled neighborhood, a solid 20-minute drive from the lake. A deep frown settled on Jake's face as he took slow steps toward the area, his mind racing. He hadn't been down here in over a month, too occupied with the fall harvest and preparing for the colder months ahead. How had all of this appeared so quickly? More importantly, who had given permission for this? Jake's heart pounded as he pulled out his phone and opened a digital copy of his property deed. He walked along the makeshift shoreline, comparing the GPS coordinates to his records, and a wave of anger flooded through him. At least 80% of this so-called public beach was on his land. Someone had developed a commercial venture on his property without so much as asking for permission. He noticed that some beachgoers were casting wary glances in his direction, whispering amongst themselves. It was clear that he was drawing attention, and it wasn't long before someone decided to act. 10 minutes later, a sleek black SUV pulled up near the parking lot, and a tall woman in a tailored business suit stepped out with purpose. Jake recognized her instantly. Karen Watson, the self-important president of the Lakeview HOA. Her expression was a mix of forced politeness and condescension as she strode toward him, clutching a thick folder in one manicured hand. "Is there a problem here?" she asked smoothly, her tone carrying an air of authority that Jake found instantly grating. Jake turned to her, his grip tightening on his phone. "Yeah, there's a problem. Someone decided to build a damn beach on my land without my permission." Karen arched an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Oh, that?" That's not a problem at all. The residents of Lakeview pooled their funds to create this wonderful community space. Everything is perfectly legal. Jake's jaw tightened. Legal? You're telling me you had the right to do this? Karen smirked and lifted her folder. I have all the paperwork right here. But Jake had a feeling she wasn't expecting him to look too closely. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a blatant land grab, and he wasn't about to let it slide. Jake took a slow, deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm as he reached for the folder in Karen's hand. He flipped it open, scanning the documents she had so confidently presented. As expected, they were nothing but a collection of permits and neighborhood agreements, none of which bore his signature or any indication that his land had ever been legally acquired for this so-called community project. The arrogance of it all made his blood boil. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, shaking his head. "These papers don't mean a damn thing, Karen. Nowhere in here does it say you had permission to build on my land." Karen folded her arms, her lips curling in amusement, as if she were speaking to a child who simply didn't understand the rules. "Oh, Jake," she sighed, "you're making this far more complicated than it needs to be. The Lakeview community worked hard to fund this project. The beach is a valuable amenity for the residents. It benefits everyone." Jake let out a sharp laugh. "Everyone except me, apparently. Did it ever occur to you that you were trespassing? That you were stealing? Because that's exactly what this is." Karen's expression hardened just slightly, though she maintained her mask of control. Now. There's no need for such harsh words. No one is trying to steal anything. The beach was an investment for the good of the neighborhood. We assumed you'd be reasonable about it." "Reasonable?" Jake repeated, incredulous. "You bulldozed my land, set up a business, and are renting out my damn shoreline without asking me. How the hell is that reasonable?" Karen's confidence didn't waver. Instead, she gave a small chuckle, as if finding his frustration amusing. "You haven't been using this land for anything, Jake. It was sitting here, unused, collecting weeds. We saw an opportunity to turn it into something productive, and look at it, it's thriving. Families are enjoying it. Children are playing. People are making memories here." Jake clenched his jaw, his knuckles white as he gripped the folder. "And how much are you charging them for those memories?" he shot back. "How much is Lakeview raking in from the concessions, the chair rentals, the parking fees?" For the first time, Karen hesitated. It was a split second, but Jake caught it. That moment of hesitation told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't about the community at all. It was about money. Jake didn't wait for an answer. He turned on his heel and walked toward the beach, raising his voice so everyone could hear him. "Attention, folks. I don't know what you've been told, but this land is private property. This entire beach was built illegally on my land without my consent." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some people exchanged nervous glances, quickly gathering their belongings, while others remained seated, watching the confrontation unfold. Karen marched after him, her heels digging into the sand. "Jake, stop this nonsense right now," she snapped. "You're embarrassing yourself." Jake ignored her. "I'm asking all of you to leave immediately. This is not public land. If you stay here, you're trespassing." Some people hurried to pack up, clearly not wanting to get involved, but others, likely Lakeview residents, crossed their arms and stayed put, waiting to see what would happen. Karen, her face now visibly tense, pulled out her phone. "Fine," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "If you want to make this difficult, we'll do it the hard way." Jake smirked. "Go ahead, Karen. Call the cops. Let's see how that works out for you." As Karen pressed the phone to her ear and started speaking to the dispatcher, Jake pulled out his own phone and began recording. If she thought she could intimidate him, she was about to be very, very wrong. Jake kept his phone steady, capturing everything as Karen paced angrily along the sand, talking into hers. He didn't need to hear what she was saying. Her exaggerated gestures, the dramatic tone, and the way she kept glancing toward him made it obvious. She was spinning the story, painting herself as the victim. Meanwhile, more people were packing up their things, some looking uncomfortable, others outright annoyed. A few residents of Lakeview, however, remained stubbornly in their chairs, glaring at Jake as if he were the one in the wrong. He didn't care. They could be as upset as they wanted. This was still his land, and no amount of entitlement would change that. Karen finally ended her call and turned to him with a smug expression. "Police are on their way," she said, crossing her arms. "And when they get here, they'll deal with you properly." Jake let out a slow, measured breath, keeping his temper in check. "Great," he said, "because when they get here, they're going to see that you built an entire business operation on my land without permission." He waved his phone at her, "and I have it all on video." For the first time, Karen's confidence flickered. It was a subtle shift, a brief tightening of her jaw, a barely perceptible hesitation, but Jake saw it. She hadn't expected him to push back this hard. Still, she recovered quickly. "You're being unreasonable, Jake," she huffed. "This beach has been a tremendous asset to the community. Do you have any idea how much property values have gone up since we developed this area? How much money we've put into making this a beautiful space?" Jake scoffed. "You mean how much money you've made off my land?" He took a step closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Let me guess, Karen. You didn't tell your precious HOA that this wasn't yours to build on, did you?" Karen's nostrils flared, and for the first time, she didn't have a witty response. That was all the confirmation Jake needed. A few minutes later, the distant wail of sirens broke the tense silence. The crowd shifted uneasily as a police cruiser rolled down the dirt path toward the makeshift parking lot. Two officers stepped out, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other shorter but stocky, both looking like men who had dealt with their fair share of suburban disputes. Karen was on them in an instant, her voice loud and filled with exaggerated distress. "Officer, thank God you're here. This man is trespassing and harassing our residents." She gestured dramatically toward Jake. "He's trying to shut down our community beach and scaring families away." The taller officer glanced at Jake, then at the beach filled with half-packed belongings, the rental stands, and the paved walkway leading straight toward Lakeview. He raised an eyebrow. "Sir, what's your side of this?" Jake, still recording, pulled up his digital property deed and handed his phone to the shorter officer. "This is my land," he said simply. "I never gave permission for any of this to be built. This woman and her HOA decided to develop it anyway." The officers stepped aside, speaking in low voices as they examined the documents. Karen's confident posture wavered as she tapped her foot impatiently, arms crossed, waiting for them to rule in her favor. But when the taller officer turned back, his expression was clear. "Ma'am," he said, looking straight at Karen, "this property does, in fact, belong to Mr. Hanson." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Karen blinked, her mouth opening and closing as if struggling to find the right words. But we invested so much into this. We followed all the proper procedures." The shorter officer sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "You might have gotten permits for construction, ma'am, but you never got permission from the actual landowner." He turned back to Jake. "Would you like to press charges for trespassing?" Jake didn't hesitate. "Absolutely." Karen's face twisted in disbelief, her carefully constructed composure cracking under the weight of reality. "You can't be serious," she spat, turning toward the officers as if expecting them to reconsider. "This is ridiculous. Do you have any idea how much this beach has done for the community? How much money has been put into it? We can't just shut it down because some farmer—" Jake let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "That farmer owns every inch of this land, Karen. You didn't build a community beach. You built a business on stolen property." Karen's fingers curled around her folder, knuckles turning white. She wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially not by someone she had clearly underestimated. "This is a mistake," she snapped at the officers. "We had every reason to believe this was public land." The shorter officer let out a tired sigh. "Ma'am, ignorance isn't a defense. You didn't check the ownership before breaking ground. That's on you." He turned toward the remaining beachgoers, most of whom were now standing awkwardly, unsure of whether they should stay or leave. "Folks, I need everyone to vacate the premises immediately. This is private property, and at the landowner's request, no one is allowed to remain here." A few people muttered complaints, but the majority began packing up their things. A father carrying a toddler on his hip gave Jake an apologetic nod as he folded up a beach chair. "Didn't know, man," he said. "Wouldn't have come if we did." Jake appreciated the sentiment, but it did little to dull his anger. Karen, however, wasn't done fighting. "I want to file a report against him," she demanded, pointing at Jake. "He's been harassing people, yelling at families, threatening to destroy our beach." The taller officer gave her a blank stare. "Ma'am, if anything, you're the one under investigation for unauthorized construction on private land." Jake crossed his arms, watching the realization finally settle in. Karen had played her last card, and it had failed spectacularly. Still, she wasn't one to admit defeat outright. With an exaggerated sigh, she put on her best look of frustration, shaking her head as if she were the one being wronged. "Fine," she muttered. "We'll settle this properly in court." Jake smirked, looking forward to it. The officers spent the next half hour documenting everything: the unauthorized structures, the concession stands, the paved pathways leading back to Lakeview. They even took notes on the parking lot that had been built, which, as Jake had just discovered, required cutting down several trees on his land. Karen paced as they worked, pulling out her phone and making hushed, frantic calls, likely to her lawyer or members of the HOA board. She had lost control of the situation, and it was painfully obvious. When the officers were finished, they handed Jake a copy of their report. "You'll need to follow up with the county to file formal charges," the shorter one told him. "But from what we've seen here, you've got a solid case." Jake took the papers with a firm nod. "Appreciate it." Karen let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head. "You really think you're going to win this?" she scoffed. "Lakeview has resources. We have lawyers. Do you even know how much it'll cost to fight this?" Jake tilted his head. "Yeah, but do you know how much it'll cost to tear all this down when you lose?" For the first time, Karen had nothing to say. As she stormed off toward her SUV, slamming the door behind her, Jake turned to watch the last of the beachgoers shuffle away. The once bustling shoreline was now quiet, stripped of its artificial charm. It wasn't over yet. But Karen had just made the worst mistake of her life. She had underestimated the man she was trying to steal from. The days following the confrontation at the lake were a whirlwind of activity. Jake wasted no time. He gathered all the necessary documents, contacted his lawyer, and formally filed a lawsuit against the Lakeview HOA. He wasn't just going after them for trespassing. He was seeking damages for illegal construction, unauthorized business operations, and environmental destruction. The more he dug into what had happened, the more infuriating details he uncovered. The most shocking revelation came when county officials arrived to conduct a full survey of the land. They confirmed that not only had Karen and her HOA illegally developed a beach on his property, but they had also cut down a significant number of trees to create the parking lot. Jake had already suspected this when he saw the paved area, but seeing the official report in black and white made his blood boil. Some of those trees had been on his land for generations, oak and pine that had stood long before Lakeview had even existed. His lawyer, Daniel Carter, was equally stunned by the blatant disregard for property laws. "This isn't just a case of overstepping boundaries," Daniel said as he flipped through the documents. "They didn't just build on your land, they actively destroyed it to make room for their project. This gives us even more leverage." But that wasn't the only thing Jake discovered. As news of the dispute spread, residents from Lakeview started reaching out, some anonymously, others more boldly. A few of them had been under the impression that the HOA had legally acquired the land, but many admitted that Karen had been vague about the specifics. One particularly revealing conversation came from an elderly couple, the Millers, who had attended the HOA meetings where the beach project had been discussed. "We were told the land was donated by the county," Mr. Miller explained over the phone. "Karen said it was part of an effort to improve local recreation. There was no mention of private ownership." Jake clenched his jaw. Karen had lied, not just to him, but to the very people she claimed to represent. She had tricked the residents into funding a project built on stolen land, pocketing the profits from rentals, concessions, and parking fees. "That's fraud," Daniel said when Jake relayed the conversation. "If we can prove she knowingly misled homeowners, this case gets even stronger." Jake had no doubt that Karen was in over her head, but she wasn't backing down. A few days later, a thick envelope arrived at his farm, Lakeview HOA's formal legal response. As expected, they denied all wrongdoing. According to their claim, the beach had been constructed in good faith under the assumption that it was on public land. They argued that tearing it down would be a detriment to the community and that Jake should be reasonable in finding a compromise. Jake scoffed as he read through the documents. A compromise? After they had bulldozed his land without asking? After they had made money off his property for months? There was no chance in hell he was letting this slide. Karen must have realized how dire the situation was, because just 2 days after the lawsuit was filed, she showed up at his doorstep. This time, not alone. She had brought a lawyer, a sleek-looking man in an expensive suit who radiated smug confidence. Mr. Hanson, the lawyer began smoothly. "We'd like to propose a settlement." Karen, standing beside him, folded her arms and smirked as if she had already won. Jake crossed his arms. "Not interested." "You haven't even heard the offer," Karen scoffed. "I don't need to," Jake shot back. "The time for deals was before you built a damn resort on my land. Now? We settle this in court." The lawyer's confident expression wavered ever so slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Mr. Hanson, litigation is expensive. Even if you win, you'll be tied up in legal fees for years. This is a chance to walk away with a substantial payout and avoid all that hassle." Jake narrowed his eyes. "How much?" The lawyer named a figure, one that would have been tempting under different circumstances, but Jake wasn't in this for the money. He wanted justice. He wanted Karen and the HOA to be held accountable for what they had done. Jake shook his head. "Not a chance." Karen's smirk faltered. "You're making a mistake, Jake," she said, her voice laced with barely concealed irritation. "No," Jake said firmly. "The mistake was thinking you could get away with this." And with that, he shut the door in their faces. The battle wasn't just beginning, it was about to reach its peak. Karen stood outside Jake's door for a long moment, her carefully composed expression slipping into something closer to rage. The lawyer beside her shifted uncomfortably, clearly not used to having doors slammed in his face. But Jake had no interest in watching their reaction. He had said his piece. He turned away from the window and walked back to the kitchen where Emily was waiting. "What did they want?" she asked. Already guessing the answer, Jake let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "To buy me off. Thought they could wave some cash in my face and make this all go away." Emily frowned, setting down her coffee. "And you told them no, right?" Jake gave her a look. "Of course I did." She sighed in relief, but still looked uneasy. "I just don't trust her, Jake. She's desperate. People like that don't give up easily." Jake knew she was right. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat graciously. If anything, her attempt at a settlement meant she was feeling the pressure. She knew she was losing, and now she was trying to find a way out before things got worse. And they would get worse for her. The next morning, Jake's lawyer Daniel called with an update. "Looks like the county is taking the environmental damage seriously," he said. "They've confirmed that the trees removed for the parking lot were on your property, and that alone is enough to hit them with additional fines." Jake grinned. "Good, let's keep the heat on them." But Karen wasn't done trying to weasel her way out. 2 days later, Jake received another visit, this time from one of the Lakeview HOA board members, a man in his 60s named Richard Caldwell. Unlike Karen, Richard had always seemed reasonable. He had been one of the few people in Lakeview who hadn't outright ignored Jake and the other farmers. Jake met him at the gate, arms crossed. "Let me guess," he said. "You're here to convince me to drop the case." Richard sighed. "Jake, look, I'm not here to defend Karen. Frankly, I think she's in way over her head. But the HOA, the rest of us, we didn't know what she was doing." Jake raised an eyebrow. "You expect me to believe no one in Lakeview questioned where this land was coming from?" Richard hesitated. "I think some of us did ask questions, but Karen made it sound like everything was handled. She said she had the paperwork, the permits. Most people just trusted her." Jake exhaled sharply. He wasn't surprised. Karen was a master manipulator, confident, well-spoken, always acting like she was in control. People like that could convince others to ignore obvious red flags. "And now you're all realizing she lied to you," Jake said flatly. Richard nodded. "A lot of people are angry, Jake. They feel cheated. Many of them put money into the beach project. Some even took out small loans to contribute." Jake frowned. "Loans." Richard's expression darkened. Karen convinced them it was an investment in the community. She promised them the beach would raise property values, bring in tourism, make Lakeview even more desirable. Jake clenched his jaw. It was worse than he thought. Karen hadn't just stolen his land. She had conned her own neighbors into funding her little empire. Richard sighed. "Listen, I can't speak for everyone, but some of us on the board want to make this right. If we can push Karen out, we can work something out with you." Jake shook his head. "No deals. Not unless it involves taking down everything they built and paying for the damages." Richard hesitated, then nodded. I figured you'd say that." He turned to leave, but paused. "For what it's worth, I hope you take her down. She's been running this HOA like a dictatorship for years." Jake watched as Richard walked back to his car, then exhaled slowly. Karen had made a lot of enemies, and soon it would all come crashing down around her. The courtroom was packed. Word of the lawsuit had spread beyond just the local county. News stations had picked up the story, turning it into a spectacle. A rogue HOA president illegally seizing land, defrauding homeowners, and attempting to strong-arm a farmer into submission. It was the kind of story that people loved to see unfold. Jake sat at the plaintiff's table, his lawyer Daniel beside him, flipping through a thick stack of documents. Across the room, Karen sat stiffly in her tailored navy suit, her expression carefully neutral, though Jake could see the tension in her jaw. Her lawyer whispered something to her, but she barely reacted. The cracks in her confidence were already beginning to show. The case was solid, the evidence irrefutable. County officials had confirmed the illegal construction, the unauthorized deforestation, and the financial mismanagement within the HOA. Several Lakeview residents had even come forward with statements, testifying that they had been misled about the beach project. Some of them were visibly angry, realizing they had been conned into funding something that was never legal to begin with. Daniel opened the arguments with a clear, methodical breakdown of the crimes committed. The defendant, Ms. Watson, knowingly approved construction on land that she had no legal claim to. She directed funds from HOA members to a project built on private property, and she profited from it through unauthorized commercial rentals. This was not an accident. This was fraud. Karen's lawyer tried to argue that it was all a misunderstanding, that the HOA had acted in good faith, believing the land was part of public access. But Jake's team had already anticipated that defense. When the county's land surveyor took the stand, he presented the official property maps, clearly showing that the majority of the beach, over 80%, was on Jake's land. There was no ambiguity, no gray area. Then came the financial evidence. A forensic accountant hired by Jake's legal team laid it out in devastating detail. Karen had not only misled HOA members, she had siphoned off additional funds under the guise of administrative costs. Tens of thousands of dollars had quietly disappeared into accounts that she controlled. The courtroom was silent as the realization set in. The final blow came when Richard Caldwell, the Lakeview HOA board member who had met with Jake, took the stand. His testimony was damning. Karen told us repeatedly that she had secured the rights to the land, Richard stated. She shut down any questions, saying the legal work was already done. A lot of us believed her, but now we see the truth. She lied to all of us. Jake didn't look at Karen, but he could feel her unraveling. She was shifting in her seat, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. The judge didn't take long to deliberate. The ruling was swift and decisive. The HOA was ordered to pay full damages to Jake, covering the cost of removing the illegal structures, environmental restoration, and lost income from his disrupted business plans. Additional fines were imposed for the unauthorized destruction of trees and wildlife impact. And Karen, she wasn't just financially ruined, she was facing criminal charges. As the verdict was read, Jake finally turned to look at her. The smug, untouchable woman who had once laughed in his face was now pale, her eyes wide with shock. She had played her hand, and she had lost. As she was led out of the courtroom, a reporter tried to shove a microphone in her face. "Ms. Watson, do you have any comment on today's ruling?" Karen didn't answer. She just kept walking. Her reign over Lakeview officially over. Jake stepped outside into the crisp autumn air, taking in a deep breath. It was over. He had won. And now, he could finally reclaim what was his. In the weeks following the trial, the remnants of Karen's empire crumbled. The HOA board, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal, held an emergency vote and officially removed her from her position. She had lost not only her power, but also her standing in the very community she had ruled with an iron fist. Rumors swirled that she had put her house on the market, planning to leave town entirely. Jake, however, had no interest in what became of Karen Watson. He was focused on his own plans that no one would dare interfere with again. The first order of business was reclaiming and restoring his land. It took weeks to remove the unauthorized construction. The volleyball nets, concession stands, and rental kiosks were dismantled and hauled away. The paved walkways leading from Lakeview were torn up, restoring the natural terrain. The county even fined the HOA further for improper construction without environmental permits. But Jake wasn't about to let the land go to waste. Instead of tearing everything down completely, he saw an opportunity. With the money from the lawsuit, he fast-tracked his original plan, building cozy rental cabins tucked among the trees, just like he had envisioned. He hired a local construction crew, ensuring that this time everything was done on his terms. Within months, a row of charming lakeside cabins stood nestled along the shoreline, complete with private fire pits, small docks, and breathtaking views of the water. And the beach. It was still there, but now it was his business, his revenue, his rules. Jake turned what had once been an illegal HOA-funded operation into a private retreat. The cabins rented out quickly, attracting visitors who wanted to escape the city and enjoy nature. He kept a portion of the shoreline open to the public, on his conditions, with his oversight. Locals who respected the land were welcome, but there were no more entitled HOA members claiming it as their own. One afternoon, as Jake sat on his porch overlooking the lake, Emily came out with a fresh glass of iced tea. She handed it to him and leaned on the railing, watching as their kids played with Rex near the water's edge. "You really did it," she said with a smile. Jake took a sip of the tea, letting the cool drink wash away the last traces of stress from the ordeal. "Damn right, I did," Emily smirked. "And you didn't even have to sell out to those HOA vultures," Jake chuckled. "Nope. And now they can pay me if they want to use the beach." A few days later, as Jake was finishing up work near the cabins, a familiar car pulled into his driveway. It was Richard Caldwell, the former HOA board member who had testified against Karen. He stepped out looking sheepish but impressed as he took in the new setup. "Got to hand it to you, Jake," Richard said, running a hand over the polished wood of one of the newly built cabins. "You turned this whole mess into something incredible." Jake shrugged. "Was always the plan. Just took a little detour thanks to Karen." Richard sighed. "Well, I came by because the new HOA board wanted to reach out. They know they screwed up, and they'd like to make peace." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess, they want a partnership now that this place is profitable?" Richard chuckled. "More like they want to make sure you don't have a grudge against the entire neighborhood. A lot of people were just misled. No one wants another Karen situation." Jake thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "Long as they stay on their side of the fence, we won't have any problems." Richard extended a hand. "Fair enough." Jake shook it, sealing the understanding. But as Richard turned to leave, Jake smirked. "Just so they know," he added, "next time someone from Lakeview tries to pull something like this, I won't be as patient." Richard chuckled. "I'll make sure they get the message." As Jake watched him drive off, he took a deep breath and looked out at the lake. The battle was over, and he had won, not just in court, but in reclaiming the life he had built. The land was his. The business was his. And no one would ever take it from him again.